Alright guys, we are back with another Master Duel tier list. So much has happened. We've had multiple ban lists. We've had multiple new archetypes released, multiple new packs, secret packs. Ban lists were crazy. A lot happened. Things got off the ban list. So many things have happened. I've added new archetypes, and if there's any that I forgot, put them in the comments and I'll add them. Tons of new stuff, and this will definitely kind of help you figure out the meta and definitely play a lot better. But you want to know how you really can get better at this game?
Are you ready to take your Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel Play experience to a new level? The Untapped GG Companion is here for you. Use the deck tracker to know exactly what cards you have in your deck, and to go over any cards you aren't familiar with yet by hovering over them. It instantly updates when you draw a card, and automatically hides if you check your extra deck or graveyard. This is the perfect tool to help you master a new deck. The Untapped GG Companion also lets you import decks directly into the game in seconds. Copy any YDK or YDKE deck string, create a new deck in game, click the Start Auto Import button, and let us take the wheel. Once the duel is over, check your win rate on your personal stats page. Brag among your friends and share your decks so they can import them into the game too. Start your path to master today by downloading the Untapped GG Companion at ygom.untapped.gg.
Alright, so right off the bat, let's get started. First things first, we have Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul is easily the best deck in the game right now. It's kind of outrageous how good this deck is. It does everything right. It basically, it's even better in Master Duel than it is in the TCG because it is a little bit of a slower deck, but with Max C in the game, it's the perfect amount of slow. Also, Max C is a hand trap that works very well with this deck because it's an earth hand trap. All earths, darks, and fires that are played in this deck benefit this deck, so you can play things like Max C, Ash Blossom, DD Crow, Dimension Shifter, stuff like that benefits this deck greatly because you have to reveal earths and darks and fires and get additional effects, and that is extremely good for this deck. Very easy to combo. And also, like I said, they already released all of the new stuff. Like, the TCG had to wait for the new stuff to come out. This just has all of the new stuff already available on release. All of it's here, automatically one of the best decks in the game. Really strong deck. Very easy to play too. Not a difficult deck to learn whatsoever. All you have to just keep in mind is kind of like the chain links. Other than that, everything is like fairly easy to play. Next is Fossil Dyna or Stun. This is a tier 3 deck. This deck is really good right now. It's probably the best it's been since the release of the game. A lot of like the back removal that used to be played has completely like kind of receded and disappeared from the game, which is quite interesting because again, it's just it really has like sort of vanished. It's not as prevalent as it used to be. Back removal used to be in every single deck because every time you're playing it's Floodgates and Eldritch and this and that, but almost everyone has pretty much cut their Lightning Storms. No one's main decking Lightning Storms. No one's main decking Cosmic Cyclones, Lightning Storms, stuff like that. Harpy's Feather Duster, most people will still main one Harpy's Feather Duster, but like other than that, most people have almost entirely cut all backer removal. So if you can just get barrier statues and fossil dynas and things of that nature onto the field, protect them with counter traps, protect them with mirror forces, stuff like that. Surprisingly and shockingly, it's actually a very strong deck right now, and probably one of the easiest decks to get you to the highest rank in the game, because the games end lightning quick. You either win or you lose. Like, you're not going to sit there comboing off. Your end board is normal summon, set 5 paths. Like, you're not going to sit there and combo off for 10 minutes. So it's actually kind of interesting to play because it's probably one of the more efficient ways to get to the highest rank in the game. Next is Vanadium. I'd say Vanadium is probably like a tier 2 deck. It's actually a very strong and versatile deck. It's very good at making rank 10s, very good at making rank 10s. And then with the Vizas and the level Vizas, Starfrost, and the level 2 monster, you actually have access to the level Synchro 8s also if you wanted to. So it's very good at making Synchro 10s, but you can also make Synchro 8s. Baron, this deck sneezes and it makes a Baron. It's just like nothing. It's so easy to make level 10s. And then also we have some of the new level 10s like Disbatter, who's really good, and we have the existing level 10s. We have Baron DeFleur, obviously very good. End board is usually 3 level 10 synchro monsters, maybe a link monster. Deck is very good with Cross Sheep also because you have the Vizas, I forget his exact name. He's the Vizas, starts with an A, is the fusion monster that you can summon by banishing things out of the graveyard. Super easy to trigger things like Cross Sheep to special summon a monster back from the graveyard because you don't actually have to play any polys or anything like that. You contact Fuse out of the graveyard. Super easy to summon. Deck uses fusions. It uses fusions, it uses synchros, and it uses links. It uses all three of them very, very efficiently. Awesome deck. Definitely somewhere around tier 2. Could even be tier 1 depending on how good the pilot is, but it's definitely a very good deck. Next is easily a rogue deck. This is Gate Guardian. This stuff is super exciting. I love when they take old archetypes and like completely rethink them and respin them. This deck is actually quite interesting. So some of the issues are some of the support is a little all over the place. It doesn't really like benefit the playstyle. I'll say that. Some of the cards, like I said, are just kind of like all over the place. That's one of the like somewhat issues of the deck. It has negates for spawn trap cards, and it has like targeting protection for certain cards, and certain cards can negate twice. Certain per turn. Certain cards can negate 3 times per turn. Like, it's cool based on the amount of materials you use to summon it. It's a really cool deck, but sometimes it can be a little bricky because naturally you're playing a lot of bigger monsters. And some of the cards aren't as searchable as you would like them to be, but so I'd say definitely it's probably somewhere in Rogue. I don't think that, like, you definitely have to respect it and understand what this deck does, and it can definitely make some cool end boards. And it is also worth noting that the Dragon Rulers are released, so you know, these are level 7s and they work with those Dragon Rulers, so it could definitely be very useful. Yeah, they're level 7, so you can make, you know, rank 7s quite easily, so that's definitely worth keeping in mind. But definitely I think it's somewhere in Rogue. Next is the Hungry Burger Novellas deck. I think this is another Rogue deck. I think it's better than the Gate Guardian deck. The deck is actually quite good. You can Ritual Summon during your opponent's turn using your opponent's monsters. That is like a pretty cool effect. This deck was an absolute terror in the Ritual Festival, but it's nowhere near as good in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, it's just not, and that's, you know, that's a part of the reality. That's why they had the Ritual Festival. They wanted you excited to buy this deck. But in reality, if we're being honest, this deck is like, it's good, but it's not great. And it could probably use a little more support to make it broken. But honestly, why are we obsessed with making decks so broken? Sometimes a rogue deck that's fair is something that's more fun to play against than a deck that's unfair. Like, for example, Pearly, which just makes everybody cry. Next, we've got Ignister. Ignister's probably like a tier 3 deck. They end on an unaffected monster, much like Pearly does, but with a little more stipulations. The deck has a lot of versatility in terms of like how easily it can build the boards, and then it has a ton of search power. It has negates that come out of the graveyard, which is extremely interesting and weird, because obviously it's not very common for that to happen in decks, but it's definitely somewhere around a tier 3 deck. Quite good. Alright, next up is Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs probably like top of Rogue or tier 3. They were supposed to get their new support, but they did not get their new support. It's kind of weird how things get released. Sometimes you have like everything released for an entire archetype, kind of like Vanquish Soul. Everything got released, you didn't have to wait for anything, and then sometimes you just have to wait for these trickles of cards that never seem to come out. Yeah, this is waiting for its new support to come out. A lot of the new dinosaur, the new normal dinosaur stuff that's coming out will help the deck immensely. I think probably somewhere around tier 3 right now, though without it. Avoid at all costs is Pure Adventure. Too many cards are hit for this to be usable, unfortunately. And then as an engine, it's only a handful of decks that can actually still utilize it, and it has to afford a lot of bricks just to utilize it. Exo Sister is probably like a tier 3 deck. It really depends on who you're playing against. This deck can go from tier 1 to tier 3 in the blink of an eye. It literally just depends on what deck you're playing against. The Martha is obviously a starter on its own, and it's actually quite a good card. And the deck in general, like, even without, as long as you have access to Martha, even without having your opponent play a deck that uses the graveyard, it still can summon, it still can put essentially 4 banishes every single turn onto the board, which is quite good. Labyrinth is tier 2. It's the best trap card deck in the game by far. It's just, it has so much recursion that other trap decks don't have, and it doesn't rely on one card the way that Eldritch does. Unfortunately, it doesn't rely on Floodgates the way that Eldritch does. It is just the best trap deck in the game by far. If you're gonna play, if you're interested in playing some kind of a trap slash, and it's not even really like a stun deck. It's just very, very tough to play against, because it just, again, it just accumulates resources, and then it gives the back row's protected, or the monster's protected while you have back row, and it's like, it can be very, very overwhelming to deal with. Also, it can play skill drain if you wanted to. So it's probably somewhere around tier 2, best trap deck in the game. Light Sworns is consider building something else. This is a deck that really needs support. It is on life support. It needs support. It just, it's not playable. Like, the deck is just not playable. It's unfortunate because it's like the archetype has a handful of good cards, but it's entirely power crept by tier limit. Tier limit does it every single way, just a better Lightsworn. Even tier limit with all of its hits is still better than Lightsworn, which is really infuriating. Next, we've got Raid Raptors. I'd say Raid Raptors is probably like top of Rogue. It's a decent deck. I don't think it's quite as good as Blackwing. I think Blackwing is the better of the two Wing Beast archetypes, and this is more of the Xseed side, and then Blackwings are more of the Synchro side, and they kind of lock themselves into their own areas. This at least gets to use some of the Link monsters, which is cool. Like, they have the Forstrix, and yeah, I believe it's Forstrix, the Link monster. So you get to play more Links. Then it's not as singular archetype locked as Blackwings are, but definitely I think it's a little bit worse than Blackwings. It obviously gets to use a lot of the Phantom Knight stuff because their cards overlap, which is kind of cool. But overall, I just think it's less powerful than Blackwings. Eldritch is unfortunately a rogue deck. It is Labyrinth, but worse. Only because this deck relies more on Floodgates than Labyrinth does. This deck has a card that is actually hit on the ban list. I forgot. Labyrinth actually got a hit on the ban list. I think it was the Cuckoo Clock went to 1 or something like that. It is a hit, don't get me wrong. It is a hit because it's one of the cards that lets you play on your opponent's board, on your opponent's turn, I should say. But I don't think it's that like big of a hit. It's such a peripheral card in comparison to everything else that's going on in Labyrinth that hitting that isn't really as big of a deal, especially because you have other cards to trigger similar effects anyway. So I think it still remains tier 2. As far as Eldritch is concerned, like I said, Eldritch has a lot of problems. It auto loses to Bystials. It auto loses to any graveyard interruption whatsoever, because if you can just snipe the DD Crow, Bystials, Call by the Grave, anything that snipes the graveyard, you essentially lose to. Especially Call by the Grave on an Eldritch is like, you just forget it. You might as well lose the duel. And then on top of that, like a lot of the D-Shifter, even D-Shifter, there's a control deck that loses to D-Shifter, which is like incredible because most control decks are like, okay, you're gonna D-Shifter me, I'm just gonna set 5 pass and wait. But like this deck, like it actually can lose to it because then you don't get your graveyard effects, which is really frustrating. Any deck that can banish a lot, this deck has trouble with. And there's a lot of that in the metagame right now. Also has trouble dealing with something like a Pearly Noir, because if you're going second, like how do you deal with that card? Once they already established it, there's nothing you can do. It's unaffected by everything, every activated effect. So like, yeah, Skill Drain will still out it, but Skill Drain's at 1 and it's unsearchable. So it's kind of a major issue that you have here. The deck is just very power crept. It still has Conquistador 2. Conquistador should be a 3. As a matter of fact, Conquistador should be a 6 because it is not helping the deck. Unfortunately, this deck actually needs Floodgates to function, and I don't think that they're bringing back the Floodgates because it's just, it's just not healthy for the game to have 8 million Floodgates. This is Bugs. This is the Insect deck, Bee Troopers. This deck is actually a lot better than I thought it was. I didn't realize how good the new Crawler monster was in this deck. There's a Crawler monster, the brand new one, that is like almost outrageously good. It's almost like a 1-card combo that ends on like 4 interruptions, which is actually kind of impressive, but you just have to like kind of start with it. It's a Crawler monster that was a common in the TCG, and then it was released as a UR on Master Duel. It is like overall a very, very strong card, and like I said, it really enables really cool combos for the deck. Overall, I'd say, yeah, it's probably somewhere around tier 3. It can definitely set up some really good boards now. Before, this deck really struggled to set up anything menacing in terms of a board, but with this, it's actually quite good. This is Goki. Goki's a rogue deck. It just doesn't really have great end boards, unfortunately. It actually has amazing combo potential. Like, literally, this has some of the best combo potential of anybody here. Like, has better combo potential than a lot of decks that I've already rated here. It doesn't it's less bricky than Dinosaurs, for example. It's less bricky than a lot of the decks up here. It's very easy to combo off with this deck. The problem is the end boards are like, it'll be like a monster that's unaffected by everything, like especially pure Goki. It's like you really don't have any good end boards. And then as far as the This deck is as good as Link monsters are in the metagame, and they've hit so many good Link 2s and Link 3s and like just good Link, generic Link monsters. So this deck just doesn't have a lot to go into like it used to, so it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Monarchs haven't gotten support in forever. That's another Rogue deck. It just hasn't been doing anything whatsoever in the metagame at all, and it's less powerful than things like True Dracos because it just can play less floodgates than True Dracos. It still has to special summon, whereas True Dracos don't have to special summon. So overall, I'd say it's somewhere around Rogue. DDD, the most high IQ deck of all time, is probably somewhere around tier 3. Same thing with this. It has great combo potential. It takes a wise man to play it. I mean, you have to use every summoning mechanic all in one deck. Incredibly difficult deck to play. But I'd say the issue is just right now, it's just not the best metagame for this deck. There's just a lot going on right now. There's too much going on in terms of decks that just straight counter this deck. So things like Vanquish Soul can really counter it with their newer card, the one that pops everything. Obviously, playing against Labyrinth is like a death sentence. And then, of course, you've got things like Stun. I mean, this deck just loses to Stun. You don't have a lot of main deck outs to Stun. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. This is Avoid at all costs. Familiar Possessed is just a worse version of almost every spellcaster archetype that's out there. The monsters don't do anything. Spawn trap cards are just generic cards that are just like, oh, gain 800 attack. When it's destroyed, summon another one. When you summon a monster with 1850 attack, draw a card. It's like very like the deck. I just think it's a very uncreative deck overall. But it, like I said, it's just one of those decks that you see at the lower ranks, usually mixed with Dogmatica, and it's more Dogmatica than it is the Familiar Possessed stuff. Neos is missing some cards, which is like Air Neos, but it's got a lot of the other stuff. I'd say it's somewhere around Rogue. It's a decent deck pure, but honestly, it's better just be mixed with all the heroes, because then you could just play things like Rainbow Neos and just play a couple bricks in your deck and just have access to a really powerful boss monster and some of the other Neos stuff. This is Fortune Fairies, Fortune Ladies, one of the worst archetypes ever made. Nothing in this archetype is broken. The best card is Fortune Fairy Every, which is the Synchro monster. You can make the argument that's a good card. I think that card is, you put that card in Vanadium's not even playing it. Like, you put that card in Vanquish Soul, they're not playing it. Like, that is the best card in the deck, and most decks, if they had that card in their archetype, they wouldn't even play it. Like, it's just, this archetype is very underwhelming in every single way. It really is power crept really badly. Adamancipator is either Rogue or tier 3, somewhere around there. It did lose Block Dragon, and Block Dragon did hurt. It did get a monster back. One thing that is interesting is that it got the old Elemental Dragon back. The one that starts with a B, it's the Earth Elemental Dragon. That is actually quite good. It is, because you can just banish Earths and then bring it back, and then it has, of course, the effect to Monster Reborn, or is it Foolish Bear? I think it's Monster Reborn, any monster in the graveyard, and that is actually like really interesting. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue, maybe even tier 3. It's definitely a deck you have to respect, especially with the Earth Elemental Dragon in it. So it's definitely somewhere around Rogue. Crystal Beast, I always put somewhere around tier 3. In terms of anime decks, it's one of the better ones. Mostly because it just does, it's totally different from all of the other decks in the game. It does its own thing, and I actually kind of respect that about it. And it has so much versatility in terms of the playstyles that you can make. You can play the combo version, you can play the control version with just like generic XYZ rank 4s that are really good. Things like, for example, generic XYZs like Cross Sheep, not Cross Sheep, I'm sorry, like Baguska and the Abyss Dweller, and you can play like the Utopia package. Like, there's so much versatility in terms of what you can do with this extra deck. It's actually kind of incredible. All right, next up is Tunes. Tunes is another deck, awesome playstyle, awesome artwork, awesome everything, awesome. Love the character. I love Pegasus in the show, but the deck is just, consider building something else. It's not good enough to be Rogue most of the time. It's just it's a very underwhelming archetype. You can try to mix it with things like Sky Strikers to get you more spells in graveyard and draw power and stuff like that. You can try to mix it with a variety of archetypes, but overall Tunes is just a very underwhelming archetype that doesn't do enough. There's only 2 monsters that can actually attack the turn they're summoned, so you can't even like OTK ever. at best you win on turn 4, and by the time you get to turn 4 against Vanquish Soul, you are not beating them with tunes unless you fill the deck with floodgates, and even floodgates are not quite good enough to make this deck good. Unfortunately, I'd say it's, and consider building something else. Next is Pendulum Magicians. I'd say it's probably around the top half of tier 3. It's a good deck, maybe not in the best place it is right now, but it's definitely a very, very, very strong deck. In general, you can play with a lot of different mixes of cards. Yeah, you've got the Electromite, which is really good, and then you've got also the Performapal, I think it's Monkey Board. So now you have a format with Monkey Board, plus you have the Electromite, which I don't think the two of them ever existed in the same format, which is really interesting, because I mean, we'll see where this goes, but I don't know that it is as strong as it is. I don't think it's gonna be like sweeping and sweeping everybody tier 0 type of thing. I definitely think it's better than it was before. It's probably somewhere around tier 3, somewhere up here. Next tier 3 deck is probably Heroes. Heroes, another deck that is incredibly versatile. Thank God nobody's playing Nibiru right now, like at all. Nibiru is not a big card because there's so many decks that Nibiru does nothing against, so it's purposeless to play. Like Vanadium can make a Baron de Fleur before Nibiru is even an issue. This Nibiru doesn't hurt. This doesn't even really get stopped by Nibiru. Obviously Nibiru. So a lot of the top decks Nibiru does nothing against, and no one's really playing Nibiru right now. So Darklaw is definitely somewhere around, I'd say tier 3, not Darklaw, but Heroes in general. This is like the full hero mix pile deck. It's probably around tier 3. I think it's a good deck. It's a strong deck. It's very versatile, has great combo potential. It can deck your opponent out if your opponent max sees you, because I've seen someone do that, which is really cool. The deck just has, it makes very good boards with Darklaw and Phoenix Enforcer, and obviously I forget his name, the one that when a hero battles he gets to pop a card, and then you've got the evil heroes, the one that can't be destroyed by card effects, and then of course you've got the acid and the other water one that they can swap out and destroy the monsters and the spawn trap cards. Like it makes very cool versatile boards. Then it's got access to the Neo stuff if you really wanted to go more in that direction. Like the deck is very, very versatile. When you sit down, you don't know which version they're playing against. They could be playing Plasma with the Destiny heroes, and the combos more or less are similar, but your end board is different depending on your variant, which is actually quite cool. And it's probably somewhere around a tier 3 deck. Shadal is probably around like Rogue, somewhere around here. It's power crept for sure, but it's definitely like a deck that you have to respect. Yeah, Winda is still difficult to get rid of if you didn't draw, if you don't top deck Imperm. Like, how are you going to deal with Winda? It can't be destroyed by card effects, and it's 2200 attack, and it locks you into, I guess, like one special summon, which is tough to deal with for a lot of decks. Obviously some decks it doesn't really matter, like if you're playing against Labyrinth, they're like, okay, whatever, welcome Labyrinth, and they summon a big monster. But like a lot of decks actually will have trouble dealing with Window, but other than that, like it's a little bit too slow. Blue Eyes is another deck that is somewhere around Rogue. It hasn't gotten support in a really long time. It hasn't even gotten peripheral support in a really long time. Like usually those cards that come out, it's like, oh awesome, this is like a card that could work in Blue Eyes, but it's intended for someone else, but it works in Blue Eyes. Like it doesn't even have peripheral support lately, which is really infuriating if you're a Blue Eyes player. There's not a lot of Exceed monsters, generic rank 8s that are coming out that are really good. There's like a lot of the things that would typically support Blue Eyes, Synchro 9s not coming out. Like there's a lot of generic stuff that would typically come out and support Blue Eyes. That stuff's not coming out right now. One thing that you can use is Blue Eyes is level 8, so you can use Blue Eyes with the new Dragon Tuner monster. I forget exactly what its name is, but it's a level 2 Dragon Tuner, and you can turn your Blue Eyes deck instead of into a level 9 Synchro deck into a level 10 Synchro deck, and you can play things like Assault Synchron, and then you can get into Baron de Fleur and stuff like that. And a Disbatter, just cards like that. But the issue is, again, it's kind of in a lot of ways just a weaker Vanadium, because Vanadium can do that without the bricks. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue, but it's definitely interesting the direction that Blue Eyes is headed. And definitely Jet is still one of the best cards you could possibly imagine. Like it's a very, very, very strong card. It returns every single turn, protects you from destruction, everybody except himself. It's actually quite interesting. This is a deck that was hyped when some cards came off the ban list, and then people were like, oh, I'm going to hand loop, and then no one plays it. So it's probably somewhere around Rogue. You have to respect its combo potential. It can hand loop you, but realistic, if you draw a hand trap or two most of the time, none of that's happening. Consider building something else is Wind Witches, because the archetype is just extremely small, definitely power crept. It makes Crystal Wing really easily, but one Crystal Wing is not going to do it in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just not going to do it. Yeah, like every deck can make more than one crystal. Not more than one Crystal Wing, but every deck can make more than one Crystal Wing equivalent level of interruptions. One Crystal Wing used to be like a big deal. One Crystal Wing, 2 trap cards. That was like, wow, how am I going to out that? Now it's like one Crystal Wing, two trap cards. It's just not enough. So I'd say it's probably somewhere where it is. They released new support for this archetype, but unfortunately it just did more of the exact same thing. Now you can make 2 Crystal Wings. It's like you just unloaded your entire hand to make 2 Crystal Wings, and then you get like Lava Golemed, and it's all gone. Phantasm Spirals is the best rogue deck in terms of price. It's the best deck in the game. Phantasm Spirals is maybe not the best rogue deck. It's up here, but it's maybe not the best rogue deck. It can play every single floodgate that's ever been invented in multiples, including the really good ones like Macrocosmos, D-Shifter, everything. It can play every hand trap. It basically can play every single thing except for normal summon, effect monsters. It can do every other thing you could humanly imagine, and the deck is unbelievably budget. So for the price of the URs, SRs, etc., this is by far probably the best deck in the game for the price. Like if you sat here and told me like, oh, you get 3 URs and you have to make a deck, I'm building this deck because it'll beat every other deck. If I'm only allowed to use 3 URs, this deck will beat every deck. But unfortunately, obviously, there is no budget in Master Duel. You're going to be playing against people in the ladder that have no budget. They have every UR, they have extra URs, they don't care. They make a new account and it doesn't really matter. But per price, this is probably one of the better decks. Incredible floodgate deck, very different versatile playstyle, very different playstyle from every other deck in the game. You literally don't use effect monsters, which is like very shockingly interesting. Infernoids is a good deck, not a great deck. I'd say it's somewhere around Rogue. It's one of those decks, like, when they start milling the right amount of cards, you just lose. Like, there's nothing you can do. Going second, they activate Reasoning. That's why most of the time when people play Reasoning, people will call number 1 because it's the Decatron, and Decatron is an Infernoid. So definitely very good deck. Definitely something you have to watch out for. Guru Control has no boss monster whatsoever. That's what it's missing. It's the boss monster. Obviously, for years it was Dragoon. Dragoon isn't in this game. It would be this deck would be really good if Dragoon was here, because it's already kind of slower than the regular TCG/OCG metagame. So I'd say it probably would be half decent, but right now I think it's like a rogue deck. You see it once in a blue, but it's really not that prevalent. Spirals is another deck that's kind of like a rogue deck, higher tier rogue deck, maybe even tier 3. It's definitely a good deck, but not like a great deck. People were like losing their minds when that Dark Magician Ritual monster came out. And they're like, you're going to search Magician's Soul, and you're going to send Master Play, and now nobody plays it. So it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Batteryman Solar is Batteryman. Batteryman is a Thunder archetype that is not as good as Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragons in every way power creeps every other Thunder archetype, including this, including Watts, including everything. This is Elemental Lords. Elemental Lords is a deck that is this is a deck that is absolutely horrific. It, by all standards, is just a terrible Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I can't believe that this even exists in, like, this was released in 2017, and you would think, based on what the cards do, that it was released in like 2001. That's how bad this deck is. It is shockingly bad. One of the worst archetypes possibly ever. It's just you gain effects based on what's in the graveyard, but you have no way to get things into the graveyard. Altergeist is waiting for a wave of support. Even with the wave of support, I don't think that it's going to be really that amazing. I think it's still going to be in Rogue. Sometimes with archetypes, and Yu-Gi-Oh is guilty of doing this. Rather than releasing something that will radically change the way the deck is played, they will release a card. They will release support that just does more of what the deck already does. And the issue with that is what the deck does isn't enough. So if you just give the deck more ways to do what it already does, it'll just it'll just have more versatile options and less once per turns to do it, but like it'll at the end board's still going to be the same. And that's the problem with this deck, is it has a very weak end board. It'll have like, you know, it's like Silkwidis, maybe like a couple of trap cards like Silkwidis, and then you bounce with Silkwidis and bounce an opponent's monster, and that's like the end board. It's just not enough when you're playing against Labyrinth, and Labyrinth can outgrind you 9 out of 10 times. Blackwing is a crazy deck. If it goes first and you have no hand traps, it's essentially the game. It's extremely consistent. It's very, very consistent. And it has summons essentially 2, sometimes 3 copies of a monster that every single time you activate a card, you get burned for life points. And it's essentially like FTK. Like, it really is, because once they have multiple of those, they have the monsters unaffected by all their card effects. Maybe they summon like 1 more negate. Once they have that on the field, like, you have to activate multiple card effects to get your combo started, and while you're doing that, you're getting burned and burned and burned and burned and burned and burned. And every time you activate anything whatsoever, you're getting burned, and you have a limited amount of card activations before you just lose the duel. It's actually kind of frustrating to play against, very infuriating. Gravekeeper is probably like a rogue deck. Unfortunately, there's too much versatility on Master Duel. If we had like a tier 0 meta where the graveyard was the thing, you needed the graveyard, moving things out of the graveyard was a must, it was the most important thing possibly in the game, then this deck would be higher. But unfortunately, there's so much versatility with so many decks that don't give a shit about the graveyard, if we're being honest. Pendulums don't care about the graveyard. This doesn't care about the graveyard. This can just out your monster before, like, it uses the graveyard, but it can just out the monster before the graveyard. I can out Nacro Valley before the graveyard even matters. Vanquish Soul doesn't really care about the graveyard. Like, so many cards that don't really care about the graveyard. So when you have a lot of top decks that don't care about the graveyard mixed with top decks that do care about the graveyard, like Vanadium does care about the graveyard, but when you have a mix of cards that do and don't, you sit down, you activate Necro Valley, and sometimes Necro Valley wins you the duel, and sometimes Necro Valley does absolutely nothing. And this deck absolutely must go first. Like, it has to go first. You go second, you activate Necro Valley, and they have an established board. That's not, like, what is that really doing for anybody? It doesn't help. Like, they have the board established. It doesn't benefit them. It doesn't hurt your opponent to have, oh, great, you activated Necro Valley. It's essentially just give your Gravekeepers 500 attack at this point. So I'd say it's somewhere around Rogue. Just right now, it's not in its best time. This is kind of like a weaker end Synchro deck. This is FAs. It's now mixed with UAs with the new support, but I'd say it's somewhere and consider building something else. There's just so many better Synchro archetypes. Next, we've got this relies on so much level modulation. It's actually kind of reasonably difficult to play, if I'm being honest. It's probably somewhere I'd consider building something else. Magical Musketeers are in Rogue. It's a Rogue archetype. It's stuck between going first and going second. It doesn't know what it wants to do. Its best monster is a going second card. Every other card in the archetype wants to go first. It's a very, very weird situation. This going second monster, the Link monster, is really good. Maybe when the new cards get in can come out, this can put a monster on your opponent's board, and then you can, like, maybe play going first, do something with it. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue tier. This is Cyber Angels, probably at the bottom of Rogue. It's a decent, I'd say it's a decent archetype for ritual summoning, but it's not like an amazing ritual summoning archetype. It's probably somewhere around the bottom of Rogue. Nothing too crazy, but definitely a playable ritual deck. This is pure Time Thieves, probably somewhere around Rogue. The only card in Time Thieves that ever really saw play was Time Thief Redoer. All the other Time Thief cards are essentially just it's not that they're bad cards by any means. Like, they have a lot of really good cards, like the dog can summon 2 monsters, and they have a lot of recursion and ways to summon Time Thief Redoer and stuff like that, and all that stuff is really cool, but unfortunately the deck is just underwhelming in its pure form. Dragon Link is definitely a very good deck. It's probably at the top of it's somewhere in tier 2. It's very, very strong right now, and a lot of the new cards, like, it has Disbatter now. Disbatter is very good in the deck. It's, like, outrageously good in the deck, because now you have other options, not just because before when you get Dark Locked, you can no longer make Baron de Fleur, but now you get Dark Locked and you can go into Disbatter and then special summon a monster from the banish and then just continue comboing off. It's actually kind of incredible because you can use any Bestial plus a Tracer, and then you go into Disbatter and you special something from the banish, and then you can reuse the monster again. It's actually kind of bananas. It's really, really good in the deck. It's probably somewhere around tier 2, and this batters an interruption. So tier 2 is probably fair, maybe even a little higher tier 2. Like, the deck sees so much good, it sees so many good results from tournaments. It's actually kind of outrageous, because obviously you have the ladder scene, which is, this tier list, by the way, is for the ladder. It's not for like the tournament scene where you get the side deck, the Master Duel tournament scene. This is more of like for the Master Duel ladder, and I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 2. It does lose sometimes to like graveyard interruptions, but generally speaking, it has so much combo potential, and there's so many playstyles for it. It's actually just such an impressive deck overall. Photon, it seems like every time, it's definitely a rogue deck. It's better than like a lot of the other rogue decks, but it seems like every time they release support for Photon, and they actually did release more support for Photon, every time they release support for it, I swear to you, it's like the support that comes out does almost the same thing that previous cards did. Like, it's like it just does more of like send to the graveyard, search a Photon or Galaxy Eyes card. Yeah, like it does a lot of the same effects that the archetype has always had. It's like more of the same, unfortunately. Special summon from graveyard, special summon when you XYZ. Like, that's the problem with this deck. It's just kind of like the support. It's like what I was saying about Alter, guys. It just makes doing what you were already doing slightly more consistent, rather than actually taking the deck in a new direction and giving it like some new powerful boss monsters. Like, wow, that is good. You know what I'm saying? They're more likely just to... They did give him a new boss monster, though. While I say that's the one that requires 3 level 8s. And the deck is very good. Like, OTKing, fantastic. Setting up a decent board going first. Like, it still sets up a half decent board going first. It just doesn't compete with some of the other really good going first boards. Next is Cyber Dragon. Pure Cyber Dragon. Okay, Pure Cyber Dragon I probably put somewhere up here. Tier 3. It doesn't really need to combo much. It's a going second deck and can use things like duality to go into other monsters. Like, it can go directly from Cyber Dragon into the level 5 dark one. I forget his name, but you can duality and do cool stuff like that. You can use the machine monster, that new machine monster card, the one that it's Clockwork Knight, to turn your opponent's monsters into machines, and then you can contact fuse with your opponent's entire board. If that card resolves, you essentially can just win the duel, wipe an entire board. It's actually kind of incredible. So Pure Cyber Dragons I put somewhere in tier 3. If I'm grading like Cyber Dragons with Cyber Darks, I'm probably putting them somewhere in Rogue tier, because it just relies so much on... It has so much more combos that it has to do, and so much more interruptible. And then on top of that, it has a lot of people are playing outs to like Pearly. So Pearly's monster Noir is unaffected by everything, and then Pearly cards can't be targeted, for example. It's unaffected by everything, can't be targeted. So a lot of people are already playing outs to that. So summoning a monster that's unaffected by everything is really not like the most amazing thing in this metagame right now. Whereas just a going second pure Cyber Dragon deck is probably around tier 3, and it's better than the Cyber Dark deck. Next is Jinzo. Jinzo is avoided at all costs. Traps have never been in a worse place in Yu-Gi-Oh ever. Like, there's usually a floodgate trap deck that's like running around somewhere. The only trap deck that you have is the Labyrinth. And that's about it. That's the best control deck in the game. Maybe the like stun deck. So like either one of these two are like the best trap decks in the game. And in reality, both of these decks have outs to Jinzo like easily. Like, Labyrinth has outs, this has outs. Like, you can't play this deck because it literally just relies on your opponent playing trap cards. If no one's playing trap cards, then the deck just loses. It's kind of in the same boat as Gravekeepers, where Gravekeeper relies on your opponent using monsters, using the graveyard. And if your opponent doesn't use the graveyard, well, it's like, you know, your deck does nothing. Your deck's main gimmick, gimmick is a floodgate. And if your opponent doesn't lose to that floodgate, well, then you just lose. So Jin's probably avoided at all costs. Predaplant Pure. I've actually been playing this a lot more recently. It's actually quite good. It's quite good as a going second deck. It can sometimes it can be a little difficult to place counters on things, but it can play main deck Super Poly, can search Super Poly. If your deck loses to Super Poly, you're losing to this. So it's actually quite good. And then it has great OTK potential. It has pendulums, and it uses fusion monsters really, really efficiently, which is actually quite nice. Definitely somewhere in the Rogue tier. Not like a super broken deck, but I wouldn't even say it really needs support. It's a nice, fair, strong deck, kind of like Novellas, where it doesn't like need support per se, because it has a lot of support, but like it's just a little underwhelming compared to a lot of the higher tier decks. Like, it can beat the higher tier decks. Like, if you Super Poly like for example, a Vanadium board, or if you super poly this board, the Dragon Link board, or even the Vanquish Soul board, like you can win if you super poly, but like in a lot of cases it doesn't really need more support. It just is where it is because of the cards that it has. Next is Dragon Maids. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue, and it's like a slightly more controlled version of Dragon Link. It's slower in almost every way than Dragon Link, so you basically have to play a bunch of hand traps and then your Dragon Maid cards, and you kind of play like a slower grind game than Dragon Link. But generally speaking, if you're looking to play a Dragon deck, I'd say probably play Dragon Link. It's just much better. This is actually quite good. I'd probably say it's somewhere around tier 2. This is Mathmech. Mathmech lost a few cards, but it got some of the new Cyberse cards, which actually benefits the deck largely. Like the new Firewall one is really, really good in this deck. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 2 still. They did hit some things, but it's not the end of the world. Obviously, Bystials are still a problem for this deck. Call by the Grave, stuff like that. But the good thing is, not a lot of people are playing the Bystials like they were before, so I'd say it's probably around tier 2. It's not like tier limit format where Bystials were absolutely everywhere. They're a little less prevalent now, so this deck definitely gets a little bit of a boost. Plus the new Firewall / Cyber support definitely helps the deck. Next is the Dark Magician deck. It is probably somewhere around Rogue. One of the better legacy archetypes, because it just has so much search power, so much, not really combo potential, but it has, it's very consistent. That's what I'll say about this deck. It's like outrageously consistent. Like getting to Circle, getting to Eternal Soul, and getting to some kind of a fusion monster is like, it's so easy to do in this deck. There's so much searching in it. There's so much drawing in it, which is actually kind of incredible because you get to draw into hand traps and things like that. So it's probably somewhere at the top end of Rogue. It's a good deck, not a great deck. It's better than a lot of the other legacy archetypes because it's extremely consistent. The only thing that's weak about Dark Magician, it's always been the problem with Dark Magician, is the end board is just very, very lackluster. Most of the time you have like an Eternal Soul, Circle, Field Spell, maybe a Floodgate or a Hand Trap, and that's about it. And that's kind of the issue with the deck. It just can be a little bit underwhelming sometimes. So it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Aromatherapy is probably like, and consider building something else. Right now, the best way to play plants is either Rika's or just an amalgamation of a bunch of different plant decks all mixed into one. That's usually the best way to play plants right now, so it's probably consider building something else. Kawaki is a deck that you would never even dream of playing pure. A lot of Kawaki cards are very, 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 very underwhelming. The good ones that you would play go into the Adamancipator deck. The rest, I wouldn't recommend playing it pure. This is Traptrix. I'd say Traptrix is probably one of the better trap decks in the game. It's probably around tier 3. It's good. Again, good, not great. It's good against a lot of decks. This is one of those decks where if it goes first, essentially the game is over because you have 8 million interruptions, very difficult to play through. Sarah just keeps triggering and triggering and triggering and triggering, and it never ends. Yeah, it's probably somewhere around tier 3. It beats a lot of decks, even in the top, as long as you go first. But going second with this deck can be a little bit of a struggle. It's actually a combo deck masquerading as a combo deck. Yeah, it's a combo deck masquerading as a control deck, where you think like, oh, this is a big trap archetype. It's actually in a lot of ways a combo deck. That's what the deck does. It makes rank 4s. It makes links plays very, very easily. It's probably somewhere around tier 3. It's a very interesting deck. Give it a try if you can. It's actually quite good. Rogue is the Knights here. I forget their first names, but the Knights, they are actually another deck that's quite good. It's just a little bit too power crept right now. Obviously, when Burning Abyss plus this deck when it first released was very, very good, but right now it's just a little bit underwhelming, a little too power creep to compete with some of the larger decks up there. Dragoonity is basically Dragon Link with slightly more versatility but less combo potential. So it's more bricky than Dragon Link, but the end boards can be a little bit more varied because you can do a lot of different things with it. I'd say generally speaking, I would play Dragon Link over the Dragoonity, but you could definitely play some Dragoonity cards in the Dragon Link deck. This is probably somewhere around here, tier 3. This is Live Twins. You can mix it with Sprite, or you can just play it pure. Either way, the deck is quite good. I'd say it's probably around tier 3. Nothing like crazy to write home about. Pure Sprite is still probably better, or Sprite mixed with some other archetypes. Like I've seen Bestial Sprite, and that's been pretty cool because you can Sprite go into a lot of level 8 monsters, Synchro 8s and stuff like that. Sprite plus Bestials can be somewhat good sometimes. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3 with the regular live twins. Burning Abyss I'm going to put next to the Phantom Knights. It's just, in a lot of ways, the deck always ends up playing with each other. There's a lot of synergy with the two decks. Pure Burning Abyss is okay. It's like a control deck, but generally speaking, it's usually better mixed with Phantom Knights. This deck got new support, hasn't been released yet. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. The new Link monster that came out, the Fire Link monster, is very good in this deck. Like really, really, really strong in this deck, but I just think it is just a little bit away from being like really, really strong. It's probably somewhere around Rogue. Zombies is probably like a tier 3 deck. It's a good deck, but not like a fantastic deck in this metagame. Changing the attribute isn't like a huge deal right now. It can be good against certain decks like Dragon Link, and it can be good against Labyrinth, for example, some of Cyberse decks. Like, it depends on, again, it's one of those things where it just depends on the matchup, how good it is. Changing attribute, or changing the typing. Other than that, it has pretty good combo potential. It does suck that it did lose one of the, it did lose one more copy of the card that mills a bunch of cards, Grasslick Screener. But what is cool is that Triple Tactics Thrust came out, and Triple Tactics Thrust can actually search a copy of Grasslick Screener, which is actually really cool, because if your opponent activates, during your main phase, especially if it's a monster effect on the field, you can set directly from your deck the copy of Grasslick Screener and just continue to combo off there. It's actually kind of incredible. Next is another deck that just kind of remains in tier 3, just because the environment of the game is just really good for this deck. This is Floowandereeze. This deck is unaffected by Max C. It can play Max C. It can play D-Shifter. And a lot of the things that hurt other decks, like Bestials, like, Call by the Grave, things like that hurt other decks, just totally have no effect whatsoever on this deck. So it ends up being in tier 3 because it doesn't care about what the other decks are doing. It just does its own thing, and it's actually kind of incredible. It doesn't matter really how much stuff they hit. They hit the barrier statue, they limited things, they've done so much to try to hit this deck, and it really doesn't matter because the deck just goes, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's kind of incredible. Next is Sword Soul. This is another deck that it just has staying power. It's probably in like tier 3 right now. It moves up and down and up and down and up and down. I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 3. It's another deck it's a good deck, but it's not a fantastic deck right now. But it's a good deck right now, but not amazing, right? It's not like beating a lot of the, it can still beat a lot of the higher tier decks. It just depends on how good your board is, and whether they bricked and things like that. But generally speaking, it has not that high of a ceiling, but its combo potential, like in terms of what it can do, it's very consistent. It's one of the most consistent decks in the game. It's one of the easiest decks to learn in the game. It's not that difficult to play. Your end board is generally, no matter what you draw, going to be Baron de Fleur, Shishao, and Blackout. That is almost always going to be on your board, no matter what you draw. It's extremely consistent, and then of course it just can go up from there. Next is Kairu Shin / Legendary Ocean. I always put this somewhere around tier 3. This deck is usually the one that I get to master rank with every single, I usually get to master, or the one right below master usually with this deck. It is just a very, very strong deck. It can break most boards. It's very good against a lot of decks that you wouldn't think it'd be good against. It's good against any deck that essentially makes a board, but it does have some bad matchups like Labyrinth, for example, because it has nothing to deal with trap cards, has nothing to deal with a lot of the it's just a very bad matchup. Labyrinth is a very bad matchup, but everything else is pretty much like a very good matchup for this deck. You can go second, you can go first. It can destroy Vanquish Soul boards. It can destroy Mananium boards, because Kairu Shin just sends things to the graveyard, and there is nothing that they can do about it. It's a continuous effect. It has to resolve as soon as it's summoned. You can't like impermanent. You can't do anything about it. It's actually kind of an incredible deck. Going first, going second. The biggest problem with this deck is two things. One, playing against Labyrinth, and then two, bricking. Bricking can sometimes happen with this deck. It's just a part of it. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't get to Kairu Shin. Sometimes you get ashed and then you have no access to like Legendary Ocean. Like, these things happen where you just lose from little things like that. All right, next up is Sylvan's. I think it's somewhere in consider building something else against Rika's better, and generic like Plant Link is just two decks that are just better than Amorphage, not Aromatherapy, I mean to say, and Sylvan. Yeah, just overall those decks are just better, just because they play the same cards, but they just have more versatility and have a better end board. This is Dino Morphia. It's a trap deck that essentially also plays dinosaurs that fuse. I think it's a cool deck. It's definitely somewhere around Rogue. It can have a lot of trouble going second. Going first, the deck pretty much will always win because it sets up a really, really, really good board with the Rexstrom and everything else. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. This is Despia's at the very top of tier 2. It's very good. It just got additional support. Again, this is like the deck that never stops getting support. It's actually kind of outrageous, and it's so expensive. Every time it gets support, it's like more URs and URs and URs and SRs. It's never anything cheap. There's no budget build for this. It's like incredibly expensive. So I think this deck is at the top of tier 2. They have Guiding Quem that got released. They also have the new Synchro monster that you can send. But more so you're going to send in a Dogmatica deck than this deck. But still, it's very, very good. And the new Synchro monster. But yeah, the deck is even more versatile. Also, you can bring back the card that locks your opponent out of playing the game. You can bring that back because the Sanctifier Dragon essentially does that exact same thing, lock your opponent out of playing the game. So the thing that they banned with the branded repulsion is now that lock is essentially back. So you can summon the Gimmick Puppet onto your opponent's board once again with the Sanctifier. Again, just the deck is once again just really, really strong, and it's back. Again, it's not, even without that support, the deck is still a tier 2 deck. It's just a very strong deck. This is probably like a tier 3, maybe even Rogue deck. This is Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragons is an okay deck, but with one copy of Thunder Dragon Colossus, the deck's just... it can have trouble actually creating a board that is worth playing, so I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Mechaba and Mechaba / Invoked is a weaker fusion engine in almost every single way than Branded. Branded has overtaken it in every single way. The only reason you would even play this is because Branded Fusion has been hit on the ban list to the degree that it is, but Branded Fusion is still searchable with other things like even like Triple Tactics Thrust can now search Branded Fusion, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, it's gotten a lot. Branded is just a better fusion engine in almost every single way. This isn't a bad deck by any means. It's just power crept, and yeah, it's unfortunate. Next, we've got the Lyrilusks. Lyrilusks are probably somewhere around Rogue. They really need some tools back. I know the barrier statue's gone, and it's probably never coming back. But the deck just needs a few more tools to make it really kind of put it over the edge. Right now, I'd say it's probably around Rogue. If you go first, you can usually set up a board that's very difficult to break, but I'd say tier 3 is definitely a ways away for this deck. Next up, we've got Salamangreat. Benefits from some of the new Cyberse support, not quite as much as Mathmech. I'd probably say it's like tier 3, somewhere around here. It's definitely a good deck, probably in a random area of tier 3. It's very, very, very consistent, always like a meta threat. Gotta know what this deck does, otherwise you're gonna lose. The Fire Link in this deck is very good. Very good. The new Fire Link, really, really strong card. Just like with other decks, I'd probably say it's somewhere in tier 3. This is Scareclaw is definitely like a tier 3-ish deck. It's out of all of Visa's decks are actually really good. So they all in some way are in the top. So Manadium's good. We've got this, all of like the Visa's decks. We have tier elements. Like is there a deck that from the Visa's lore that's not good? I don't know if there is, but I don't think there is. But Scareclaw, a Tri-Heart is just a really good card. Changes things to defense and is unaffected by their effects. The thing is it's a crazy card. It's really, really difficult to deal with. Definitely somewhere around tier 3. Their trap card, the one that negates, is really good. Like the deck is definitely a tier 3 threat, somewhere around there. Next is Sky Strikers, I'd say is probably top of Rogue. There's so much interruption right now for Sky Strikers. There's just a lot of cards that are just it's just the matchups that Sky Striker is good against is like other control decks, and it almost always wins against other control decks. But right now, the typical type of decks that Sky Strikers would usually beat are just not very prevalent in the metagame. Now, this is a deck that still, if you have a good pilot, can get to Master very easily, but it's definitely a lot more difficult than like getting to Master with Vanquish Soul, for example. Drytron is probably like a tier 3 deck. It still has a ton of combo potential. It's like insane how much combo potential this deck still has. It spams so easily. It's definitely like a tier 3 threat, somewhere around there. Utopia, I'd say, is, if we're being honest, probably around probably like around the middle of Rogue. There's a few different ways to play Utopia. One of the ways is actually funny. It's actually an FTK. That thing is so annoying. Sometimes you just run into it on the ladder and that you don't have a hand trap and you just lose. And it's almost always a bot that does it. It's just an FTK bot and you just lose. There's nothing you can do. It just burns you for like 10,000 with the Numeron Dragon. It's kind of an insane card. And then the regular way to play it, which is all of like the usual Utopia combo cards, though that is actually a fairly good deck. I'd say, again, it's probably in Rogue. This deck has so much support, it's almost outrageous. So you sit there and you're like, how am I supposed to play this deck? There's so many different variants and ways to play it. Like, what am I actually supposed to do with this deck? It's kind of all over the place. This is Gladiator Beasts are somewhere, I would say, in Rogue also. Gladiator Beasts are like a decent deck. You can mix it with Tri-Brigade. That's one way to do it. The other way to play it is just kind of like a pure deck, but going second with this deck is just not as good as it used to be. Because the effects activate at the end of battle phase, so you have to enter the battle phase successfully with monsters, battle, and then you get to do stuff. And honestly, that gimmick is just a little bit too slow for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And then if you play it kind of like the new way, you end on like an Appaloosa, and this guy negates, and like a variety of cards like that. Just it kind of sucks that the classic way to play Gladiator Beast is kind of lost in the rhythm now. It's just not, unfortunately, it's just not strong enough. Not anymore. This is Plunder Patrol. I'd probably say like a tier 3 deck. This is always like a deck that is like definitely a threat. If you don't know how to play against it, you will lose against Plunder Patrol. It's kind of cool too, because it like uses every summoning mechanic almost in a certain way, like Vanadium, like DDDs. Not quite as much like DDDs, because DDDs literally uses everything, pendulums, everything. But this uses equips and stuff. This is really cool. I'd probably say it's somewhere around tier 3. Buzzsaw Shark and the Sharks are probably somewhere in Rogue. You can mix them with Goatee, and the deck is somewhat competent. The deck, like I said, the deck overall is fairly good. The only issue is that it keeps peripherally getting hit, so it lost Totally Awesome. It lost Goes in Match. Like, cards that were just very important to this deck are gone. So it's tough. It's like peripherally, it just has suffered. It used to be a deck that I would easily put in tier 3, and now I put at the bottom of Rogue. This is Orcust is probably top of Rogue, top half of Rogue. It's a good deck, but it's another one that's just like, I honestly think this deck is power crept. Everyone was like, oh no, they're gonna take this card off the ban list and it's gonna change it radically. They've almost entirely unlocked the deck, and if actually, I'm pretty sure they unlocked the deck fully. And it still doesn't do much, because it's one of those decks, kind of like Burning Abyss, kind of like Phantom Knights, where it's just it's one of those decks that was very, 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 very good, and it's been power crept really, really badly, and now it's kind of stuck in this Rogue tier with Sky Strikers and all the other decks that have just they're not bad decks, they've just been power crept. And if you have a good pilot, you can still get to Master rank, but it's gonna lose against a good Vanquish Soul player most of the time, because the deck just does more. This is why am I forgetting this? Abomination Prison Unchained. This is what it is. It's probably somewhere in Rogue. It's waiting for new support. When the new support drops, it's probably going to be somewhere up here, like between tier 1 and tier 2, because it is a really good deck in the TCG. It's probably the best deck in the TCG right now. And if I'm being totally honest, I actually think it'll be even better in Master Duel, because it benefits in a lot of ways, sort of like Vanquish Soul benefits, where the deck has really good grind game, and you don't have to worry about like losing in time, or like taking too long. Like, none of that matters, because you can play it out on Master Duel. You have forever to play, and on top of that, it has such a great matchup against so many decks, because it's so versatile. Just as long as your card is destroyed, you get to keep going and going and going and going, and the new cards will definitely break this deck. And it doesn't really lose to Max C the same way that other decks lose to Max C, because even like a set 2 and pass, is still pretty good in this deck because everything floats. Yeah, I'd probably say Rogue is where it is right now, but it's definitely going to be creeping up when the new support comes out. This is Amazement. Amazement is like bottomish Rogue trap deck. I'd say it's like a decent deck. It cannot compete with Labyrinth. It cannot compete with Eldritch. It cannot compete with Altergeist. It's just one of those trap decks that's kind of lost in the shuffle now. It's like a cool deck because you can equip this trap cards to your monsters, your opponent's monsters. You get different effects based on who you equip it to, and the boss monster is really good. But unfortunately, it's really, really like just sort of lackluster. A lot of the effects, unfortunately. So I'd say probably somewhere around Rogue. This is actually quite good. I'd say this is probably tier 3 Virtual World. It's one of the only decks that can still use the Adventure package. And honestly, it's just such a versatile deck that it can still come back to the metagame over and over and over and over again. In the TCG recently, it actually topped, which is kind of shocking because like the deck just can do so many things. Like it can make rank six. It can make rank 6s, synchro 6s, synchro 9s. It can even now make synchro 8s depending on how you play the deck, but it just has such a nice like library of monsters that it can go into that the end boards are so versatile on this deck. So you never know what you're going to get depending on the build, depending on the player. You can get totally different boards, which is kind of impressive about the deck. Ghost Trick, I know now firsthand. Before I used to say this was avoided at all costs. Now I'm sure it's avoided at all costs because I actually played against this in my in one of my other series, the Masochist series. And I played against this deck, and I mean, it was a competitive game I had a random pile of cards, and my opponent had a constructed Ghost Trick deck, and it was a reasonably competitive game, and that should tell you something, because you know a random pile of cards is losing to 99% of these decks, but it had a reasonable matchup with Ghost Trick. Next is this is Marincess. I'd say probably somewhere around tier 3. Another deck that's just like, it's water Salamangreates, but I think it's less, it's probably close to consistency with Salamangreates, but I think the end boards are slightly better on Marincess, but this is more consistent, which in Master Duel, consistency matters more than great end boards. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3, but they're very, very close in terms of how good they are, regardless. This is Machina / Earth Machine. I'd probably say it's like in tier 3. It's a deck that doesn't make a particularly impressive board, but you have so much grind game. It's insane. This game has so much grind game, and then Clockwork Knight has really changed it because it turns all monsters on the field into machines, and if it sent to the graveyard, you get to search like it's for any Earth Machine. So the deck is very, very good. Then you have Therion King Regulus. You just have so many weapons available to you. It's definitely like a tier 3 deck, somewhere around there. Next is the Tri-Brigade. Tri-Brigade is a pretty good deck. I'd say they just released the Zodiac, so Zodiac Tri-Brigade may be making a little comeback here. I'd say it's probably in the top half of Rogue. It is a bit power crept if I'm being totally honest, but I'd say top half of Rogue is like super duper fair for this deck. Despite the power creep, it's still a deck you must respect because if you don't, you're going to get Appaloosa and then Tri-Brigades to special summon them all back and then banish with your Shirog, and it's just a very, very good deck for that. Alright, next up is Mech Knight, typically played with Invoked or just pure. I'd say it's probably like a rogue deck. It's really tough to go second in this game, generally speaking. In this play, it does have a huge benefit of there's no game 2, there's no game 3. It's a best of 1 format, so more than likely your opponent's going to pick to go first. So I'd say it's probably somewhere up here. Your opponent's going to pick to go first most of the time. And then no one's playing around your columns, which is actually quite nice. I just say, like, it's another one of those decks. It's not bad by any means. It's just a bit power crept. Same thing with all of the like Link era decks. A lot of them have the same problem where they're not bad at all. They just don't do as much as the newer decks, unfortunately. Weather Painters is a decent deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. It would really benefit from more skill drain. Skill drain at 1 really hurts the deck because that was its like main floodgate that it could run and get away with. I can't really run many other floodgates, but Skill Drain is definitely one that it could, so it's probably there. Harpies is a good-ish deck. I'd say it's probably middle of Rogue. It's one of those decks that, this is a deck that really needs support. It has some cards that are absolutely broken. like really good. Like Harpy's Featherstorm, absolutely broken. And then it has a bunch of cards that are just, I don't even know what to say. They're just like so lackluster. It's unimaginable. They have so many cards that just do almost nothing, and they have like 5 cards that are really, really good. This is a deck that really needs more support, and then maybe a better identity, because right now it doesn't really have many things to end the board on, but it has like a lot of, you have great combo starters, you have great cards in the archetype like Harpy's Feather Duster, Harpy's Featherstorm, among other things, but then overall the deck is just kind of like, the end boards are a little underwhelming sometimes. Runick is always somewhere in Rogue. It's just really annoying to play against. They hit it almost every time, it seems, on the ban list, which is really odd. Say Runick is probably middle of Rogue. It's one of those decks that you never really want to face, but like when you face it, it's not the end of the world, as long as you just have to race them. Especially Runick Stun. You just have to activate your cards before they can mill your deck. And then there's Runick mixed with other stuff, so like Naturia Runick and stuff like that. And that deck's probably like better. Naturia Runick is probably somewhere up here, but regular Runick is probably there. Naturia, perfect. Naturia is probably like a tier 3 deck. It's a really, really good deck. If they summon Naturia Beast against most decks, like, they're gonna win. Naturia Beast, and then the newer Naturia cards that are actually really good let you synchro summon. Quick effect. It's like those cards are really, really, really strong. And then of course you've got yeah, just kind of the you've got the Naturia stuff, and then you've got, of course, the Runick stuff. So that deck is actually really good. They can end on Naturia Beast, Barkion, whatever else. Yeah, pretty good. It's crazy that for years and years and years, almost all of Yu-Gi-Oh's existence, Naturia has been a terrible deck, but it's actually like a pretty good rogue deck now in almost every format. Madolche is another deck that is like a good rogue deck. I'd say, oops, what did I just do? What have I done? Alright, so there you go. It's probably, what am I doing? Alright, here we go. Madolche is probably like a tier 3 deck. It's one of those decks that is like so off meta, and it's such a good combo deck that most people don't know how to hit it, first of all. And then second of all, it's just attribute wise so far from everything else that it makes the deck very, very good. You can also play Gozen. You can also play There Can Only Be One, because they do have some different types, so you can kind of play around it a little bit. And then of course they do have a variety of other things, like you can play anti-combo cards, like you can make the Traptrix or Affliction, stuff like that, to play around the Nibiru. Like the deck overall is just a very strong combo deck. It's probably somewhere around tier 3. Then you've got Abyss. This is like Mermills and the Abyss cards. I'd say that's probably somewhere around Rogue. This is a deck that's very, very expensive. You almost never see anybody ever play. And truthfully, it's not really worth the payoff, because, like, yeah, it can benefit from generic water stuff. But I don't think it's, like, better than some. It's not better than the Marincess, for example. Like, I'd say it's probably more fun to play the Marincess, because the combo lines aren't as they're not as determined. They're not as predetermined. But outside of being more fun than Marincess, it's not better than Marincess at this point. Cleaforts are probably same thing. They're like Rogue. They're just, nothing's really moved up or down for them since the last one. They're a machine archetype that tributes, benefits greatly from skill drain, which is now at 1. So I'd say probably around Rogue. It's not like, it's a deck that you can definitely win with, but it's not like that fantastic. EMR is a really good card in the deck. Then we've got Fluffles is always a pretty good going second deck that is just generally, it's just a pretty good going second deck that most of the time, what's awesome about Master Duel is most decks do not want to go first. I mean, most decks want to go first and you want to go second, so typically that will end pretty well for you. That goes up there. Red Eyes is actually in a better spot than it's probably ever been. It's probably at the higher end of Rogue, because now they have all of the element dragons. So the rank 7 engine is crazy. You have the Galaxy Tomahawk, and then you have all of the Red Eyes, and that's pretty crazy, right? You have the Red Eyes, all those element dragons. Red Eyes is like super easy to spam 7s. You have the element sabers. You have, like I said, the Galaxy Tomahawk. You could do a lot with Red Eyes right now. It's kind of crazy. Then we've got artifacts are a avoid at all costs. It's just not a deck that's really usable in the metagame. Like I said before, not a lot of people are way at the beginning I said not a lot of people are playing back removal, so definitely they're not going to be doing that. Cosmos, Farm Girl, Cosmos, I'd say, are probably like very, very like center middle of Rogue. It's not like a bad deck by any means, but it's not like a fantastic one. Their gimmick is they summon these big ships that can't be targeted, and that's cool and all. It's almost like, in a certain sense, it's like they have like quick effects, especially some of these giant ships. They can't be targeted. Targeting is not the main form of removal right now, so just that alone makes it kind of like iffy. I'd say it's probably at the middle of Rogue tier, somewhere around here. I just accidentally moved Novellas. It's been moving down because I've been placing decks over it, but Novella's probably somewhere up here. But yeah, I'd say it's somewhere at like the middle end of Rogue. It's not a bad deck, but not great by any means. Speedroids is like another synchro archetype that I'd say is pretty good. It has a lot of extenders and it has a lot of starters. But again, the problem with this deck is kind of like it's got a little bit of an issue because it wind locks itself. And you can make good stuff because wind synchros are good, and there's some really good wing synchros. Clear Wing, Crystal Wing, Baron de Flora. There are some good wind synchros, but like at the same time, you lock yourself out of the really, really, really good kind of like synchros, or just the versatility of synchros you lock yourself out of. And it's kind of the same problem that resonators have, if I eventually see them, where here we go, they kind of like lock themselves into certain things, like Dark Dragons. Their best card is their resonators. Their best Red Dragon Archfiend / resonators. Their best card is their Synchro 5, and it's one of the first, I forget, it's like a Red Rising Dragon. I don't remember what the exact name of the card is, but it's one of the first cards they make, and it locks them into, and unfortunately locks them right into the Dark Dragons. I think Dark Synchro Dragons from the extra deck or something like it. It's something of that nature, but it locks you into a certain type of monster, and then it cuts greatly which ones you're allowed, essentially what your end board can or cannot be. And both these decks have that little bit of an issue. Now this is getting support, so it will move up, but as of right now it's probably somewhere around here. Blackluster Soldier is, I'd say it's probably in consider building something else. Just overall as an archetype, this card, the ritual archetype of Blackluster Soldier is very, very underwhelming. Even if it's a new support card, it's still not quite that good. Sharinui is consider building something else. I wouldn't recommend playing pure Sharinui. Its ceiling is just very, very low, and it's not even that its ceiling is very low, but it's very tough to kind of get the wheels turning, unfortunately, with this deck, because you just have a ton of cards that need to either already be banished or in the graveyard, and to do that over a course of a few turns is possible, but to like get that going quickly is very difficult. So it's a very slow deck in the modern game. I would recommend instead just playing pure zombie, just zombie world. Next is Viacroids. Last time I rated this deck very poorly. I was wrong. I think it's even worse than I thought it was. I recently did a tier list on this, and this deck is just like unfathomably bad. Like, you actually sit down and read all of the cards in Viacroids, it is like horrific. It is so difficult to play the deck that it's the intended way to play it. The best way to play this is to play like a super control deck, like the most control deck you could ever imagine. Yeah, that's the best way to play it. It's super duper 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 void control, and then you attack directly while you're preventing your opponent from doing anything at all. That is the best way to play it, unfortunately, and it's a pretty boring way to play it, if you ask me. Magician Girls, just play Dark Magician. Magician Girls are all bad except for maybe Chocolate Magician Girl. The rest of them all suck, and Chocolate Magician Girl is just okay, and the rest of them are not good. Then we've got True Dracos are probably around like the middle of Rogue. It's a good deck. It's got the same advantages that what's that deck called? Not Fossil Dine. It has the same advantages that Floowandereeze has, where it benefits from being so different from the rest of the metagame that it can basically, it has a lot of advantages. Like if you get Max Seed, okay, thanks, no problem. Like, it just doesn't do anything. Max C doesn't do anything. D-Shifter does a little bit, but you can play around D-Shifter for a little while, right? You can stall for 2 turns, and then continue to play the regular way. Like, you can do a lot of things with your cards that don't really matter, which is actually quite nice. So yeah, it's difference from the metagame is what separates. The same thing with Cleave Forts, same thing somewhat with the Monarchs. Buster Blader, I think, is like kind of bottomish of Rogue tier. It's one of those decks that it's a one-trick pony. The whole point is to set up a lock of Buster Dragon plus you summon Buster Dragon and then Destruction Swordsman, change all your opponent's monsters in defense mode, negate their effects, turn them into dragons. That's the whole point of the deck. That's the entire gimmick. If you don't get that off, you lose. If you get that off, you usually win. And that is essentially a lock. Digital... This isn't Digital Bugs, is it? Yeah, this is Digital Bugs. Digital Bugs is an okay deck. I think Crawlers generally are a better flip effect insect deck, but if you're really trying to play an insect deck that will actually win, I recommend playing the Beat Trooper deck. And Beat Troopers essentially play all the different insects: Battle Wasps, Crawlers, Bee Troopers, generic insect support. This is like the Dragon Link of insects. So I just think that you should be playing that instead of Digital Bugs. Digital Bugs are just very underwhelming. Like, their best card is their newest card, and their newest card is just okay. So it's really not that good. Paleozoic is a deck that, again, it's kind of like Sharks. It got hit peripherally so much that the deck is not super playable, and it's also simultaneously pretty power crept, because a lot of the Paleozoic effects are just kind of lackluster, if we're being honest. It's like Papa Spawn, Trap Card, Book of Moon 1 Monster, Discard, Banish. It's like they're like other cards that exist in the game that have been power crept a long time ago, but their additional gimmick is that they special summon a level 2 monster back to the field. But now there's no real payoff to that, because you've lost Totally Awesome, and you've lost some of the other things, unfortunately. So the deck is just a little too slow. Also, Graphic Screener is unusable in the deck because, I mean, it's at 1, and at 3 it would have been nice, but now at 1 it's a little rough. And it's not like with Triple Tactics Talents. If you're playing like a monster-focused deck, your opponent's going to try to Ash stuff, but you can't just like set 4 and then try get your opponent to activate Triple Tactics Talent. Triple Tactics Talent doesn't work the same in a back row deck as it does in a deck where you're trying to combo off and your opponent's interrupting you, unfortunately. Also, it lost Pot of Prosperity and Extravagance, so its draw power is limited too. Next, we've got this is the rank 8 Lunalight deck. I forget what's the name. It's 8 axes. I actually think this deck got better. Believe it or not. It's probably a top 20 deck in the game. I haven't rated everything, but it's probably like a top 15, top 20 deck in the game. There's a new Dragon Tuner, a level 2 Dragon Tuner that just came out in the new pack. I forget his name. I think it's like a Rimbrum or something like that. I don't know what it is, but it's a very good card. It's basically a level 2 tuner monster that special summons itself if there's a non-effect monster on the field, and then it can generate when it's used for single material, it can generate a token that's also a tuner, and it's level 2, so you can summon it and then summon like Bigfoot, for example, make a Baron de Fleur, summon another token, summon another level 8, and then make like Disbatter, for example, or like Chaos, what's his name, the Chaos monster, that the Chaos Angel, for example, and all of a sudden you've got like these going second level 10 synchros. You have so much access to it so easily, and it's actually kind of an impressive card. Also, that card is quite good in other decks, but in this deck it's actually very strong. Exodia I wouldn't recommend playing. It's just, you have to like essentially go first to do it, and if you're going second, you're already at a massive disadvantage. Then we've got this is Spellbooks. This is a structure deck that's available. I honestly think the best way to play it is just mix it with another spell caster archetype, such as Dogmatica, such as a Dark Magician, something like that. On its own, it's a little bit underwhelming, so I'd say it's probably like bottom of Rogue. A lot of the cards are really good, and obviously it's got one of the most broken spell cards of all time in it, but at the same time, it's just a little bit too, like, you're getting a lot of resources that aren't really that great, so you're like recurring resources that aren't going to do much for you. Crusadia is probably like in the top half of Rogue, I'd say. Not the top half, probably like the middle of Rogue, somewhere around here. Just because although this deck is like somewhat good, again, it suffers from having to go second because it's the best going second. It used to be able to go first, but with Crystron, Hecla Fibrax gone, that whole like going first with the Crusadia Arborea from, you know, that whole combo is kind of gone, so you kind of have to go second, and that's not as good as when you could set up a huge board. Prank is like at the top of Rogue. It's one of those decks that is just a bit power crept at this point. It used to use the adventure package, but now that's kind of hit on the ban list a little bit, and it's lost a few cards. I think the Link monster is limited to 1, so there's a lot that's happened that has kind of power crept this deck a little bit. Zodiacs is an interesting one. I think that this is probably like a tier 3 deck somewhere up here. This deck got a bunch of cards off the ban list. It was already kind of a tier 3 deck because going second, it had a lot of ability to just like essentially wipe any board. It got a few things back. So it got the, I believe it's Ram to 1. I think that's what went to 1, and then it got Zodiac Barrage, most importantly, to 3. So now you've got 3 Zodiac Barrage. I think you've got Ram, and that's pretty good for the deck, because Zodiac Barrage was always a good card. It searched Zodiac monsters, so it gave you access to things, which is quite good. And yeah, the deck is as good as it's ever been. It can go second, make Zeus very, very easily going first, Trident, stuff like that. Like, the deck overall is very, very good and very consistent. Its only problem has always been the same problem, it's just that it just runs out of resources sometimes. But you can play things like the Zodiac combo, which is the trap card, and a Pot of Avarice and stuff like that to try to recur the resources and go through the Zodiacs all over again. But that's really always been the issue with the Zodiacs, is they just kind of run out of juice because you put all of these monsters with all of these materials underneath onto the board. Next, we've got Pendulum and Endymion. I'd say it's somewhere around Pendulum Magician, somewhere in this area. Definitely a very good board, and definitely going to be very interesting to see it played. Maybe not the Endymion version, but in general, Pendulum's played with the monkey boards. This is one of the worst decks ever, Dream Mirror. Not really that it's that bad. I think the artwork's cool and the playstyle is, yeah, and the playstyle is awesome, but it's just overall, it's just lackluster. There's just, I mean, there's a lot of issues with it. Like, an awesome playstyle, get to use field spells, put them on both rows. The artwork's beautiful, but like overall, it's just very difficult to set up, unfortunately. Next is Traptrix, which I've already done. I think this is a repeat, so we have a few repeats. This is a repeat, and this is a repeat, unfortunately. Next, we have Ancient Gears. This is consider building something else. Ancient Gears is a cool archetype. I've always liked it. Always thought it was awesome. Ancient Gear Chaos Giant's an awesome card. I love the deck, but unfortunately, I don't think it's very competitive in today's game. It's very difficult to OTK your opponent with that deck. The better deck, for sure, is Machina / Earth Machine. I think it's somewhere up here in tier 3. This is a mix of a bunch of different Earth Machine decks, including Ancient Gear cards like Ballista and the Ancient Gear box and stuff like that. I'd say play that instead. Symphonic Warriors is probably like around a rogue. It's like a rogue deck down here. You can make a multi-interruption board, but like it kind of needs very specific cards to open. You have to open very specific cards to make that happen. So I said probably bottom of rogue. Libromancer is a pretty good ritual deck, and just a good ritual engine in general. It was one of those things that was good in the ritual event. Probably like the top half of rogue. Actually, not top half of rogue. Probably like the middle of rogue. It's probably somewhere around there. Probably somewhere around novellas. They're like similar ranges. Cool ritual engine, but the problem with ritual is its core, which is, you know, it just uses a lot of resources. The resource suck, unfortunately. Next, I keep moving stuff accidentally. Next is ABC. This has always been a good deck. It's one of those decks that, again, it's like one of those 2016, 17, 18 decks that were pretty good, but unfortunately it's just been power crept. It's not that it's a bad deck, it's just been power crept. It's kind of like a variety of other decks that are here that are just, they have been power crept, and they're struggling to really play in the modern metagame against things like Vanadium and Despia, and just decks that are just better at what they do than ABC's, unfortunately. It's a cool deck, but I'd say it's probably at the higher end of Rogue. Earth Machine is probably somewhere around here. This is not Earth Machine, this is like the rank 10 trains, but essentially you're playing these decks interchangeably anyway. Pure Therions, I would avoid at all costs. It's not worth playing. Slifer, just because Pure Therions, like, they have some cool cards that you can use, some cool synergies, but for the most part, your board is going to be like, maybe like 2 negates at most, and it can be a little underwhelming when it's pure. Usually you just mix it with other stuff. Slifer, the Sky Dragon, is one of the more difficult ones of the God cards to use. Raw has a lot more support. Slifer is unsearchable, unfortunately, and I mean, you can search him with the Jack Knight and stuff like that, but in that deck it's not that great. This is Punks. Punks are, I'd say, probably like a tier 3 deck. It's still a very good deck. Psychic Hand Punisher is just a game-changing card. It's a really good card. I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 3, probably at the higher end of tier 3, and then a variety of other, obviously you can combo with a variety of different decks. You have level 3s, level 7s. Any deck that can use level 7s can work with this. You can actually use, because a lot of them have different attributes, you can maybe even mix the elemental dragons with them, which would be actually pretty cool to see. Sprite is a deck that is definitely like in the top half of the game. It's probably somewhere up here. Pure Sprite is still very good. Obviously you got to always try to put some Sprite with some sort of rank 2 deck, but the Nimble package got hit among a variety of other Sprite essentials, so I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3 still though. This is a repeat, unfortunately. Next, we've got another deck that I wouldn't recommend playing. This is Final Countdown. You have 1 copy, and you have to wait 20 turns. I mean, do the math. It's not that good. Then we've got Grenmaju is probably like a rogue deck. There's a variety of ways you can play this. You can play this as a control deck, or you can play this as an OTK deck. Either way, I think it's somewhere around rogue. I think it's cool, but relying on one monster that you can't search can be a little bit infuriating. Winged Dragon of Ra, they gave a bunch of God card stuff, so there's a bunch of people playing God card decks at every single part of the ladder, but despite that, the decks are just really not that strong, unfortunately. God decks they have some support, but they're just full of holes. Winged Dragon of Ra has the most support, but he's just the worst of all of them because he can't be special summoned. You have to like cheat to special summon him, and there's like a ton of issues with him, and then he can be targeted and destroyed and all that stuff. And then the rest of the God cards, they just are very difficult to search, but this one I'd say is probably somewhere around rogue. This is Winged Dragon of Ra. Gem Knights, the FTK you can do, or play it kind of as a beatdown strategy. FTK is a lot less consistent than it used to be. I'd say it's probably somewhere around rogue. Relinquished is a deck that I just believe is just straight up incomplete at this point. It has very, very few cards in the archetype. It's like the whole archetype's like 7 cards. Somebody told me to do a tier list of this, and it would take me 8 minutes. Like, it's just such a small archetype, and it definitely needs more support. This has already been rated. It's a repeat. Witchcrafters is just a super lackluster deck. Unfortunately, it has a very, very low ceiling. It's very consistent, but it has a very, very low ceiling. I would recommend just play Dogmatica instead. It's a spellcaster archetype that is much better. Again, it creates lots of resources, but just that's it. That's what the deck does. Sylvans is not Sylvans. This is we're gonna call this Plant Link. Plant Link is a pretty good deck. I'd say Plant Link is somewhere up here, and I think it's a pretty good deck. It can do a ton of stuff. It can set up a multi-negate board, Cactus Bouncer, obviously Therion, King Regulus, the Lily. It can play all of the Sun Avalon stuff, in addition to the Sun Avalon card that negates all cards when the Link 4 is there. It's like a skill drain. You could do that. You can play the Aromatherapy cards wherever I put them, the Sylvan cards. Like, the deck is just incredibly, incredibly versatile. Next, we've got Ancient Warriors. This deck is, like, I'd say in the regular ladder, I'd probably say it's probably like a rogue deck, but whenever there's an event that comes around, somehow this deck always survives that ban list and ends up being a totally playable deck. No matter what the event is, I don't care if you're playing Ritual, I don't care what you're playing, somehow this deck survives every single time and ends up being a pretty good option. The Ichizu cards are almost all hit on the ban list, so there's one single Miller left, and you literally couldn't play that as a pure deck if you wanted to. G Golem is almost like a supplemental archetype for Cyberse decks. You can mix G Golems with like Salamangrates. You can mix G Golem with basically any deck that can use Cyberse. So like these guys, Mathmax and stuff like that. You can use the new Firewall stuff. Say it's probably around the top of Rogue. It raises the ceiling of the deck. Like, it can put more things on the board, but now you're playing larger and larger bricks. So I'd say probably like top of Rogue. Sue Ships is another archetype similar to Ancient Warriors, where it's kind of like an okay archetype, generally speaking, but the second like a festival comes out, for some reason they never hit this card, and it ends up being like a fully playable deck in like a festival where it shouldn't even be around. It'll be like, oh, we're doing a Legacy festival, and all of a sudden it's like Sue Ships here. What does it have to do with Legacy? Nothing, but you can play it. Crawlers are probably like bottom of Rogue. Crawlers have some really good cards, like the new Crawler monster that flips a monster and then special summons an insect. Like, he's pretty good, and a variety of other things. But generally speaking, I'd say if you're going to play insects, best thing to play is the bee troopers. I'd say are probably the best insect archetype that you could possibly play. Skull servants are another deck. They're just kind of at this point, they're just a little tough to play, especially if the grass looks green or gone. It's not as sacky of a deck. I'd say probably Rogue. It's not gone. Of course, it's limited to one, the grass looks greener, but I'd probably say it's Rogue. And generally, I think you should just, if you're going to play zombies, just play Zombie World with all the other stuff like that. Rikas are a pretty good deck. Rika with Sun Avalon is good, but also Pure Rika is actually quite good, and it's quite budget. It's one of the better budget decks that you could possibly play in the game. So if you have a few like extra gems lying around, some few UR points lying around, you can actually build this deck without a lot of investment. It's definitely like a tier 3 deck. It's like if Lair of Darkness like worked a lot better. It's probably around the top of tier 3. Next is Gaia. This is a structure deck, but it's also a lackluster deck. Unfortunately, it's just an OTK strategy. While it's cool, and I love this deck, right? Personally, I love this deck. It's an OTK strategy I think is pretty awesome, but the big issue with this deck is that it just is really tough to OTK when there are so many floodgates and interruptions, and this deck doesn't really have ways to play through interruptions. It just kind of tries to do its best to summon big monsters despite what's going on the field. So for that reason, I think it's kind of like a rogue deck, bottom half rogue deck. Numeron really is not in a great place right now. I'd say it's probably like the bottomish half of rogue. It's kind of in the same boat as Eldritch, where it's just, it used to be really good, but now it's been number 1 power craft, and number 2 it's just, there's a lot, like Numeron is good against like boards that are just like, you just summon a bunch of monsters that are like, oh, I have 4 negates on the board, and then you kaiju the one that's like an omni negate, you activate the Numeron wall, and then you go from there, and that's usually the best way to do it. But unfortunately, it's kind of those boards are kind of a thing of the past, and now you have more boards that float into other things. So like Despia is like a death sentence to play against for Numeron. This is like a death sentence to play against for Numeron. This is like a death sentence. The Labyrinth is like a death sentence. Like, a lot of these floating archetypes are so difficult to play against Numeron because you essentially have to have your attacks connect, because if they don't connect, you can't win. It just doesn't happen. While you attack, you gain attack points, and then you're eventually just not going to be able to do anything. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around there. This is Destiny board. I don't recommend playing Destiny board. It's just a mess of an archetype. It's always kind of been a mess of an archetype, and the new support that came out didn't really fix that. This is Synchrons. Synchrons, I'd say, are like middle of rogue. There are pilots out there that are very, very strong with this deck, but the issue with this deck, and I think the largest issue with this deck, is that it just struggles whenever you hit the junk speeder. It's like very tough to do anything once junk speeder gets negated or impermed, or whatever the case is. Like that card is just too much of a crutch for the deck. Also, it is missing some of its newer support, so once the new support comes out, it probably can be a lot better. Next is Amazonas. I think Amazonas, while a good deck, is just a little bit too underpowered to play in the modern game. Another issue is that Gozen Match, and both Gozen Match and the other card, Gozen Match and Rivalry, work flawlessly in this deck. They're amazing in this deck because it's all Earth Warriors. While those cards are great in this deck, they're limited to 1 in Master Duel, so you can't even like operate under them. If you had both of those, I'd probably grade the deck higher, because being able to play under 2 floodgates and not even blink is like a huge deal. I'd say it's probably bottom of rogue. This is the Vernisloof stuff. I'd say it's probably consider building something else. It was good with the Ichizu package, but obviously that's gone now, so you can't even play that. I'd say there are decks that you can get away playing it, but for the most part, those decks are pretty much gone. Tearlament is, I'd say maybe it's either bottom of rogue, top of rogue, or like bottom of tier 3. This is a deck that has been power crept so badly that it just became I don't even know what to say. It just became disappointment at this point. It's just that they kept removing and removing and removing aspects of this deck to the point where it's just not even really like playable anymore. Because it's not that it's not playable, it's that it's very, very inconsistent, and it's just very prone to breaking. And there are games where you can play this deck and set up on a fantastic board and everything goes well, and there are games where you play this deck and you just lose, unfortunately. Next is Kaijus. You're not going to play a pure Kaiju deck. No one ever plays a pure Kaiju deck, but Kaijus are very good. This is a deck that is waiting for one new support card that got announced. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. It's better than most of these Rogue decks, actually. Yeah, it's probably somewhere around Rogue. It's a good deck, and it just kind of struggles going second. Going first, this is one of those decks kind of like Traptrix, where if you go first, it's actually kind of tough to beat because the field spell is really good. It protects all of your monsters. It lets you draw 2 cards every single turn. Like, it does a lot for you, and also you have the Cerulean Skyfire, you have like all of those other cards that give you protection. The trap card makes you gain life points. Like, there's a lot of good aspects to this deck, but there's also kind of a troublesome aspect where going second can be really, really difficult. Next is Generators. I'd say Generators are kind of like the top middle of Rogue. Good archetype overall, just kind of at this point isn't a great place for like it can play around the fact that terraforming got hit because it has its own like built-in metaverse into the archetype and stuff like that. But overall, the deck I think is probably somewhere on the top half of Rogue, maybe even like a little higher, honestly, like the better half of Rogue. Dark World is waiting for a new support card, which has been out in the OCG and the TCG probably like over a year, maybe even 2 years now. I'd say it's probably like in the top half of Rogue. This is a very good deck. It can play through everything. Like, it can literally play through everything, even Max C, except for D-Shift. It can't play through D-Shifter. But it can play through pretty much everything. Like, Danger Dark World is very, very good. That new support card is important because it sets up, it just makes the setups very, very easy because you search a Dark World card and then discard a card. So that is just very, very good. You can search, discard Snow, search, discard like the little guy Ceruli. Like, it just searches and discards, and it makes it very, very easy to actually combo off with that deck and then put things onto your opponent's board if you want to, and put Ido and lock your opponent out of the game, but a variety of different things like that. So it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Next is Goatee. Goatee is I'd say it's near the top area of Rogue. It's a good Rogue deck, but it's not like a fantastic Rogue deck. It's definitely got some little issues going on with it, with its consistency, but overall I'd say it's in the top half of Rogue. It's all about banishing fish, and then the fish synchro summon during the standby phase, and you can banish your opponent's board. It's a pretty cool deck. I'd say it's probably, like I said, top half of Rogue. It's definitely better than playing Sharks because Sharks have been power crept. I never thought I'd do this, but the dragons, the elemental dragons, are probably like a Rogue deck right now. They're not like an absolutely broken deck, but they are a Rogue deck. They are usable with, there's a lot of those names now, because I think Blaster's at 3, Tempest is at 3, and then you've got the water one, Title is at 1, and then Redox is at 1. So you've got, how many is that, 8 of them, which is pretty good. And then the little dragons, I don't think are banned at all, so you can play all the little dragons. I think the deck is like getting to a place where it's in a really, really good situation. We'll see where it goes. Like I said, at this point, I think it's going to be better in other archetypes and very supplemental in other archetypes, and that's going to be nice. Like, for example, like Mermills are going to be good with the water one. And there's like a lot of decks that are going to benefit from this being out there. And then, of course, you have the Galaxy Tomahawk, which helps this deck combo off because any 2 level 7s is Galaxy Tomahawk, so that's pretty good. I'd say the deck is probably at the top half of Rogue right now, which is crazy because last time I put it in Avoid at all costs. That's probably the biggest jump of any archetype here because, again, you just took monsters off the ban list. That's all you have to do, and that's where it is. Samorg is, honestly, probably consider building something else. Samorgs are, in almost every way, just a worse version of Floowandereeze. Like, in almost every way. Like, to the point where you can use the Floowandereeze card. You can use the Samorg cards in Floowandereeze. Like, that's how much. It literally in almost every single way. It's like they built. It's like they built Samorgs and then went, that didn't work out. Let's build it. Let's make it again and make sure it actually works this time. And then they built Floowandereeze. Like, that's how that's almost to the level that Samorg is kind of like underwhelming. Now, if I was like, I'm only putting consider building something else because there's a better version of the deck in here. But if I was to grade it, like actually grade it, probably like be at the bottom-ish of Rogue. It's like a playable deck, but it's not like incredibly amazing. Evil Eye is a very original deck. There is no middle, consider something else. It's very original. I'd say it's like the top half of Rogue. Once you set up a couple of Selines, equipped with a few things, it's very hard to get over. They gain 500 attack every single turn, and it gets to the point where you just can't deal with them, and they just have so much attack. They can't be targeted, can't be destroyed, and it gets really annoying. So top half of Rogue is probably where it's at. Pearly is... it's definitely not in consider building something else. I mean, you should consider building something else, but it's probably tier 1. It is one of the best decks in the game. It did get hit, but it got Master Duel hits. It didn't get like TCG hit. It got Master Duel hits, which, to be honest with you, I'm starting to really like Master Duel hits, because Master Duel hits don't like destroy the deck. Sometimes you want to keep playing the deck. Like, you invest all these gems in a deck. You want to play it. You don't want it to just like, oh man, they banned my favorite card. Like, there's none of that going on, and I like that they hit these decks this way, because they kind of reduce the consistency of the deck without like getting rid of it. So like Despia, for example, right? Despia, they keep reducing the consistency and access to branded fusion, but the deck is still playable, and they keep giving you new cards to play it in different ways. Same thing with this. It's cool that they reduce the consistency a little bit, but it's still up there. It's still a tier 1. You could argue top of tier 2, tier 1 deck, but it's definitely one of the 2 best decks in the entire game right now. Next we got Mekanko. Mekanko, I think, is probably... last time I think I put it either in Rogue or bottom of tier 3. I'd probably say it is at the top half of tier 3. Best going second deck right now in the game. Best going second deck, probably by far. It's one of those decks that sometimes you lose the... you win the coin flip, you go first, and you think you're going to have a good time, and then you learn very quickly you are not having a good time, because they like kaiju something, and then they just attack into your monsters and win the game because you take all battle damage. It can be very, very, very annoying. Kashtira, I think, is a top 3 deck in the game right now. It's just very, very consistent. I think it's probably tier 1. You can make the argument it's tier 2, or top of tier 2, but it's somewhere between these 2 places. I think it's worse than Pearly, and I think it's worse than Vanquish So, but I think it's better than all of these other decks here. It's a very strong, very consistent deck. It just has the ability to just put giant monsters onto the board. It goes second a lot easier than a lot of the decks around here. So yeah, I'd say probably top of tier 1. Definitely a very strong deck. This is a repeat. Rescue Ace is a deck that is, I believe it's good, but it's not like an amazing deck. I'd say it's probably in the middle of tier 3, somewhere like, yeah, somewhere around the top half of tier 3. It benefits from being a newer archetype, so it has like newer card text, so it has like more powerful cards than older card like archetypes. But generally speaking, I'd say tier 3 is probably the most fair place to put it, because it's not like dominating the metagame, but you definitely need to know how to play against this deck, because it is a very strong deck, and if you don't know what you're doing, you will lose to it. It has one monster that just that sets 4 cards into the back row. It's kind of insane. And then its field spell is in a lot of ways similar to, kind of similar to Runick Fountain, where you can put back 4 cards and then draw a card, which is really good. Obviously, it's not a quick effect, but you can still do it. And it's good because it can recur from Banish, or it can recur from the graveyard. It gives you a double normal summon. Like, there's a lot of really cool aspects to that deck. Ninjas, I think, are at the top half of Rogue. Honestly, if we were in a Kashtira only metagame, this would probably be even higher, because this deck has a really good matchup with Kashtira. I actually win games against Kashtira, but then there are some decks that this deck just has unwinnable matchups against, or just matchups that aren't that great, like Labyrinth, for example, just does nothing against it. Any fusion deck, like this deck, does nothing against, because you can fuse if you base down cards, but otherwise I think it's there. If we had all Kashtira, like I said, I think it'd be a lot better. This is I forget what they're called, Aquamirror, but it's Gishki, that's what it is. Gishki is pretty good in this environment, just because you can use Sprite Elf is still around in Master Duel, so it's actually quite good with Sprite Elf. This deck has a bunch of cards that are not once per turn. Not once per turn at all. Not hard once per turn. Just straight up not once per turn. Combo goes on and on and on and on and on, and the search loop that they can do is just insane. And it's kind of what you need in modern ritual decks, because if you don't have that kind of like insane search, like that insane engine, that insane resource loop, you just can't really compete, especially as a ritual deck. So I'd say it's probably somewhere at the top half of Rogue. It's very, very good. Then it has the new negate monsters, pretty good. Prediction Princess is kind of like, I'd say it's like a bottom half Rogue archetype. It's all based on rituals and flip effects, which are the two, some of the worst summoning, which are some of the worst mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is ritual and flips, and it combines both of them in one archetype, and it kind of works a little bit, but it's a little bit weak. The rest of all of these are repeats, so that is actually the last archetype that we're going to go over today. If you enjoyed this tier list, please let me know, and if there's anything that I missed, please let me know about that, and thank you for watching. La 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 la.